when you're trying to assess whether they might be telling you something that you should listen to or not. And as you know, I'm Canadian. I'm born in the West. I'm born in Alberta, but have been living in Ottawa for the last 6 years. And so I work at a public university called the University of Ottawa and teach international development and global studies. I've been teaching, well, actually, I've been working in Latin America since 2004 as an academic. But previous to that, I also have a little bit of experience in Nicaragua. So shout out to Jim. It was my first experience in Latin America, and I was there in 1998 and also in 1999. So after the Contra War, when the neoliberal governments were running Nicaragua. And more recently, I've been working in Venezuela. The first time I was there was in 2008, and the invitation came from the nationalized major telecommunications company called CAN TV, which I think would be the equivalent in some ways of the PBS in the United States or CBC in Canada. The Chavez government nationalized this telecommunications company in order to have a state-owned television and communications network. And so that was my first time in Venezuela. And since then, I've been back 2 times, I think, most recently in August of 2012. And so I haven't been there during the recent protests, but I've been working with a colleague and friend and other revolutionary socialist, Jeff Weber, and we've been doing interviews with the left of Chavismo, meaning the people who are critical supporters of the Bolivarian revolution. So these are people who are on the left of Chavismo with respect to the fact that they want to push towards a form of socialism. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about in our work are the tensions within that process. I also have done a lot of work as an academic because, as you may suspect, as an academic, you also need a gig that gives you the big grants so that you can pay for your friend Jeff to come to Caracas. So I work on public services. I work on public service privatization, alternatives to privatization. So most of my work has been in Bolivia. And so for me, right now I have a federal grant from the Canadian government to study local water management in Bolivia and in Venezuela. And so that's been helping to finance the work that Jeff and I have been doing in Venezuela with the left. So that's a bit about me. And again, you guys can interrupt at any point, stick up your hand, ask questions. I don't mind being interrupted. I'm not going to talk too much. I'm going to talk maybe 20, 25 minutes. I often say that, and then as a true teacher, end up talking too much. I'm sure that I didn't catch her name, I think, but Mock, the unemployed teacher, probably understands what I mean. Yeah, you understand what I mean. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit in terms of context for a conversation, the history of the opposition mobilizations, which, because in the article that we recently published in New Politics, we call it the third insurrectory moment. So I'm going to talk about the extra parliamentary mobilizations of the Venezuelan opposition as a context for the current events. And then I'm going to end with weaknesses and strengths of the Bolivarian revolution. And I should start by saying that in Venezuela, people refer to the Bolivarian revolution as el proceso, or the process. And so it dawned on me only upon my 3rd time going to Venezuela that the more radical horizontalist left really do try to divorce the movement from Chavez the man, and we'll talk about the Bolivarian revolution rather than Chavismo. But I'll address a little bit of some of the weaknesses, and I'm suspecting by the fact that this is a small bookstore with people who work with food not bombs and housing issues that a lot of people in the crowd self-identify as anarchists. Am I correct? Just guessing. I mean, no one needs to out themselves, but it's interesting to note that in Venezuela, the anarchists actually support the Bolivarian revolution because a lot of the innovations of the governments are very horizontally oriented. And of course, it's riddled with tensions and problems, but it would be interesting to have a conversation with you guys about those kinds of politics if you're interested. Sound good? Yeah. One of very strong workers' movements in Cincinnati, Ohio. No? In terms of an organized left. Occasionally. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we're all getting hammered by neoliberalism. That's less true in Canada than the US, I think, but certainly we have one of the most embarrassing governments internationally these days. So really, I should stop talking about Venezuela and go organize in Canada because we're in trouble. But anyway, so let's go on about Venezuela. Um, and just as a preface before going to the history of the opposition mobilizations, for those of you who are new to Venezuelan politics, it's important to note a couple of things. One is, I think it's really important to note that Venezuela has technically been a multi-party democracy since 1956. It is an exception in Latin America with respect to that it has some kind of form of pluralism within the electoral system since 1956. And that's very different from Brazil, from Argentina, from Bolivia, from Ecuador, which experienced authoritarian governments that were non-constitutional forms of rule. That being said, really, I think the story of Venezuela is about the expansion and challenge of the notion of democracy. As anybody in this room, I'm sure, is committed to horizontalist forms of socialism. And in fact, there is no such thing as socialism from below. Sorry, that's the reverse. There's no such thing as socialism from above if you are truly a socialist, because the goal of a socialist model or an anarchist socialist model is really horizontal forms of decision making and democracy in different ambits of social life, particularly the fact that we spend most of our waking hours either looking for work or working. And so these kinds of questions have to be central to a project. But it's important to note that Venezuela has formally been a democracy, although I prefer the term polyarchy, which is a nerd political science term because I study political science. But it also connotes the fact that polyarchy has existed in Venezuela since 1956, but that doesn't mean that it was democratic, because basically what happened from 1956 until the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998 was an exchange of power in a very similar way to the exchange of power between the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States of America. And I will suspect that there's no one in the room that finds that that is truly an alternative platform or an alternative vision of society put forward by either of those parties. So the same thing was happening in Venezuela until Chavez was elected. One of the breaking moments historically in Venezuela was in 1989. An event that it has been dubbed by the Venezuelans the Caracazo, which means the protest in Caracas, Caracazo. So the protests emanating from Caracas. It's a bit of a misnomer because, in fact, these protests happen across the country. And the protests were motivated by the fact that the government implemented an austerity policy that reduced or that attempted to increase the price of oil, which immediately was transferred to the working classes through increases to basic transportation. So those people who need to go to work suddenly woke up one morning and found that their bus fares had increased astronomically. And so while these protests in 1989 are often described as a spontaneous form of protest, there's wonderful books and history books such as We Made Chavez, which is by a wonderful political philosopher, historian named George, I can never say his name, but Sicarario Meyer. And he describes how really the Venezuelan story when you excavate the history, similar to places in the US, similar to places in Canada, there's always organizing going on. There's people organizing in the housing movement. There's people organizing in the water movement. There's people organizing against deportations. There's people organizing. And so the same thing is true in Venezuela. There's a revolutionary history in Venezuela that has been masked by the fact that it's always been noted by especially American and English-speaking academics as an exceptional democracy, which was masking a lot of the tensions that were actually part of this model of exchanging office between two bourgeois parties, similar to the Republicans and the Democrats. So after 1989, this protest that emerged, the state sent out state troopers to repress these protests that had emerged when people went out to protest the fact that bus fares had increased with armed force. So innocent protests were gunned down in the streets, and between 300 and 3,000 people lost their lives. And it's always scary when you see a range that's that wide. You don't know if 300 people died or 3,000 people died. It's because, number one, the morgues were full, there were mass graves, and many people were disappeared, meaning that the families never found the bodies. So imagine what it would be like. It's kind of like Ohio State, of course, had a very, very similar event happen in the early 70s during the Vietnam War, where I don't remember who it was that shot the 4 students in the university. Yeah, Kent State, sorry, but it was in the state of Ohio, correct? I only remember that because Neil Young wrote a great song about it. That's why I remember it. But very similar, it was a huge shock to the Venezuelans, and it led to people being more open to left alternatives because suddenly their state was attacking them, but not attacking them. 4 people lost their lives in the Kent State massacre. I'm not sure if it qualifies as a massacre with 4 people, but probably the estimates that are most accurate are more towards the 3,000. And so imagine that you wake up in the morning and your state is sending out the troopers to kill people in the barrios. And so this was a huge shock to the Venezuelan people, the popular masses. And Chavez, who was a military leader and a very charismatic person, attempted a coup d'etat against the state to overthrow this democratic bourgeois system in 1992. He failed in that, but then presented himself for election in 1998 and won with 56% of the popular vote. And so since 1999, Venezuela, so that's now 15 years, has been run by a government that has an orientation towards redistribution. So that's an important part of the story because I think that is really the reason why the opposition is so angry, is that they have run the state, they have run the oil state, and they have funneled all of the money from the oil wealth towards their own people for most of Venezuelan history. And so when an upstart military guy comes in, takes office, and starts channeling money towards the barrios, there is truly a threat to their hegemony. There is truly a threat to their standard of living, except for the fact that because of the oil boom, when Chavez took office, oil was $40 a barrel. Today, oil is around 110, 120. I credit this increase in oil prices almost single-handedly to the Venezuelans because it was one of their very conscious foreign policies to reactivate OPEC, which had been dismantled by neoliberal governments successively, especially with the US's control over Middle Eastern regime states such as Egypt. And so OPEC had collapsed after the oil shocks of the 1970s. Chavez appointed very smart ministers to reactivate OPEC. Of course, that's a fundamental contradiction for anyone who's concerned about the fact that we are destroying our own habitat. But it is also true that very dissimilar from Canada, which is an oil state, in Venezuela, they are pursuing a model that is much more like Norway, where the oil wealth is being channeled into social development. So just a few facts on that. Although it's a region-wide trend with the election of new left governments in Latin America, where rates of social inequality are actually dropping across the region. It's true in Ecuador, it's true in Bolivia, it's true in Argentina, it's true in Brazil. Venezuela has experienced the most dramatic reforms under Chavez. And so the Gini coefficient, which is the coefficient which measures the top 20% and the bottom 20% and the gap between those two, has dropped in Venezuela from 0.59, which is actually higher than the US, to 40.4. Currently, the US stands at about 57. And so in terms of the rate of reforms, or perhaps we might even want to call them revolutionary reforms in Venezuela, there has been massive social investments in the decommodification of basic goods such as education, health, housing, water and sanitation, and experiments of social control by workers in the productive apparatus of the state. So that's the context in which the opposition has the right, in their terms, to be very angry about what's happening in Venezuela because they are not certain of their future. And so Jeff and I wrote an article recently entitled February Traumas, the Third Insurrectionary Moment of the Venezuelan Right. And we call it the third insurrectionary moment because it's actually the third time since 1998 that the Venezuelan opposition has used extra-parliamentary methods to try to destabilize the government. And so I'm really happy that we're talking about this today, but I don't want to dramatize or overstate the importance of what's happening in Venezuela. In fact, I think the media is making mountains out of molehills in some ways. And I will address why I think that's the case in a minute. But the first time that the opposition forces, and again, this is an opposition that was used to having controls over the reign of the state. They and their henchmen and their cronies were used to using the oil wealth for their own purposes. And so Chavez, who was elected in 1998 and took office in 1999, was initially a social democrat and was not interested in transforming the capitalist system. There's a wonderful biography by Marta Hanecker, who interviewed Chavez. He spent, I don't remember how many months he spent in jail after his unsuccessful coup d'etat, but he was reading social democratic work. Anyway, so in 2002, the opposition organizes a coup d'etat, and they managed to depose Chavez for 47 hours. At this time, Chavez's government was simply a social democracy, maybe analogous to Canada, like nothing super radical, talking about universal health care, things like that. It was unsuccessful because people filled the streets of Caracas and had Chavez restored to office. And in particular, the presidential guard remained loyal to Chavez and actually brought him back from exile to Venezuela. There's a fantastic documentary about that for anyone who wants to see it, called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." Oh, yeah, will not be televised. The second insurrectionary moment is when the coup d'etat failed. The right wing decided that they would sponsor a strike, a bosses' strike. So the people who ran the State Oil Company, which is the major source of public revenue for the states in Venezuela, stopped production. And this was between December and February of 2002 and 2003. The gross domestic product dropped by 26% that year. So it was a major economic disaster. So it was a project of economic sabotage. It was also unsuccessful because in that context, workers, rank and file workers loyal to Chavez, said, we're going to run these oil companies ourselves. And so they actually uncapped the wells and started redistributing domestic oil and gas and started production themselves. And this is where a lot of the experiments for workers' control in Venezuela were born. So one of the points that I think is important to remember in this history is that thus far, and I'm not sure it's going to be the case of the most recent protests, every time that the opposition has mobilized against the Bolivarian Revolution, it has absolutely backfired. And in fact, helped the activists who want to see greater distribution of social wealth or even a new form of production of wealth. It's given them gifts. In the coup d'etat of 2002, for example, people in Caracas came to the streets because they realized what they almost lost. After the oil strike in 2002, 2003, workers decided, hey, we can do this ourselves. Maybe we don't need bosses. So I think it begs the question, what is going to happen after these 2014 protests in Caracas? So what's happening now? What's happening now is basically some right-wing students at the private university in Caracas, which is called the Universidad Central de Venezuela, or the Central Venezuelan University, started to protest because there are some real issues in Venezuela for the right wing. They include shortages of some basic goods, such as toilet paper and flour for cakes and some basic goods. Of course, we have to consider the fact that the sabotage, most of the distribution of food products and products such as toilet paper are still in private hands in Venezuela. And so what they've done systematically during protests is hoard goods. And in fact, in the strike of 2002-2003, the right wing was heavily criticized for hoarding milk instead of distributing milk to the stores, meaning that children in schools were not getting free milk because the right wing decided it was better to dump it down the gutter than to distribute the milk, right? So we have a problem here still in Venezuela of private control over things that ought to be public goods, such as food, or at least distributed in a way that meets basic needs of everybody and every citizen. So in February, early February this year, the students started to protest, and then it inspired right-wing leaders who were angling to replace the opposition candidate called Capriles. And so then the protest escalated from there. From what I've read in the press, and again, I have access to the same information that you do, except I have probably a few more friends on Facebook from Venezuela who also update what's going on. But what's important to remember about these protests is that the international media is really excited about these protests, and they love sending cameras there, and they love filming violence because it conforms to their ideas of what democracy should look like, which is not redistribution. I mean, these are private media chains that are interested in telling a story about Venezuela, which is not the story of the average Venezuelan, the workers of Venezuela. So the protests, from what I've read, mostly take place in the wealthiest part of Caracas. So the wealthy people are blockading themselves. They have to go out and go get their milk and then run back to home because they're not sure what's going to happen. Life in the barrios of Caracas, which are mostly in the western part of the city, looks fairly normal. They're not experiencing these problems. The barricades, the blockades, etc., have been set up by the wealthy Venezuelans, not the average Venezuelans. And there's very little evidence to suggest that the average Venezuelans who have been the supporters of the Bolivarian Revolution, that have voted for the Bolivarian Revolution massively in elections that Jimmy Carter, who's no radical, says are the most sophisticated technological revolutions in the world, and he's observed 92 elections in the world, have won, except for one. And so I love debating the right wing on Venezuela because their story is based mostly on lies, misdemeanors, and half-truths. Because what's happening in Venezuela is that the right wing has barricaded themselves in their own neighborhoods. It's like, and then unfortunately, innocent people who are going by, and one of the things that's been happening is that they've set up guillotines, or they've set up wires that are invisible. And so the majority of deaths that have happened, and there's been 30 deaths related to this violence instigated by the Venezuelan right, have been these invisible wires that have cut off the heads or damaged or physically harmed to death people who drive motorcycles, which is a preferred method of transportation for people that have less access to money, to the poorer folk in terms of socioeconomic indicators. So we can talk more about what's happening, but I'll just jump to the weaknesses and the strengths, and then I'll end. So if there are some weaknesses in Venezuela, and of course any process, a political process in particular, is not perfect. We all know that from our own experiences in organizing. When you guys are at Soapbox, you can't agree on everything all the time. You try to work probably through consensus. It's difficult work. Nothing is perfect. This is not the point. But if I'm going to name 3 weaknesses of the Bolivarian Revolution, I would name 3. The first is, it is true when you read in the news that there is a serious problem with the security situation in Venezuela. The 3 times that I've been there, I will never, ever, ever go out at night unaccompanied in Venezuela, in Caracas in particular, because it is an incredibly dangerous city. It's one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Strangely enough, the rate of violent crime has actually increased, according to some indicators, since Chavez took office. The rate of petty crime, however, has decreased. That being said, I think that the governments have not taken the security situation seriously enough. However, it's probably very complicated. And if you look at places like Mexico, Mexico basically qualifies as a nearly failed state in some areas of Mexico right now. And so it might have to do with the fact that the drug rings have reorganized themselves and then are also setting up shop in Venezuela. I don't know enough about the security situation. But I don't mean to make light of the political violence that has been occurring in Venezuela over the last month or so. 30 people have died. I'm really sad to say that it is actually an absolute normal thing in Venezuela. I mean, you guys are from the US. I'm from Canada. Like in Canada, we don't have too many deaths related to stabbings and murders, but I would even be curious to know at the end of the year if it was a more violent year than other years. And sad to say, but I have a friend who worked for the Ministry of Justice, and she's a revolutionary socialist. And she admitted to me in private, she said, one of the areas that we have not taken seriously enough is security. And so just now, or as of year, they've been starting to experiment with community forms of policing. And so that is the kind of thing that I think needs to happen to address the situation of security of people, of average people. So the second weakness that I would point to is that of bureaucracy and corruption. This was clear in every interview that we did with the left of Chavismo, or the left of the Bolivarian process. And it's not as if bureaucracy and corruption are new in Venezuela, but that the players have changed. So it used to be that the cronies funneled all the oil money to their own people. Now it's a new gang there. That doesn't make it right. There is still a layer within Venezuela of the old state that is very difficult to get rid of. Sometimes they paint themselves in the colors of Chavismo for the purposes of self-aggrandizement and power. And so these people will also actively sabotage some of the most innovative experiments, such as the experiments of workers' control in Venezuela. And I can give examples if you guys are interested in that. And the third one I would say is actually the idolatry of the president. If you are a true person committed to any horizontalist form of democracy, it is a concern that there has been so much worship of an individual, that individual being Chavez. And so we did a wonderful interview with a barrio activist who is from a revolutionary guerrilla or an armed movement in urban Caracas. His name is escaping me right now, but his first name, Juan Contreras. And he said, of course, we do not want Chavez to die, but in some respects, his passing might be a gift to the movement. Because right now, Chavez takes too much space in the popular imaginary. And if you're truly talking about a horizontalist socialist movement, it is something that has to be owned by everybody in that country, rather than something that centers on one individual and his charisma. So that, I think, is a weakness. It's a weakness that is very much acknowledged by Venezuelans themselves, particularly Venezuelans on the left. And Venezuelans who'd be the equivalent of you people in Cincinnati, Ohio, if you guys were in Caracas, you'd be having the same conversations. Like, maybe this isn't so great to have just one person who's the symbol of all this. But let's end with the strengths, because I think I'm actually still optimistic. I don't think there's going to be a coup d'etat in Venezuela. The first thing is that where was the international media when where the Bolivarian forces or the Socialist Party won hands down the municipal elections in December? They won something like 80% of the municipal governments. And so while the presidential elections in October were too close for comfort, where Maduro, the current sitting president, only won by something like 50.59%, which is kind of scary, which is why the right wing sees an opening. It doesn't mean that by any means have most people abandoned ideas of the Bolivarian Revolution. I think that's indicated in part by their strong support for Bolivarianism in the December elections. Number two, whenever you see any kind of statistic about the economy of Venezuela, always take a statistic like gross domestic product, per capita. Don't invest too much in that statistic, or the statistics about inflation and the eroding wages, because in the last 15 years, people get so much more of their basic goods for free from the state. In that way, it's a bit more like the Cuban model, where I think the minimum wage in Cuba is something like, that sounds absolutely ridiculous to us, like $40 a month. But if you just give that $40 a month without saying your education is free, your world-class healthcare is free, your recreation is free, and you're getting free karate classes for your kids at the local center, it misrepresents the lived experience of the Bolivarian Revolution, which to me explains why it is that people have returned to the polls to vote again and again and again and again for the Bolivarian Revolution, is that their lives are better. And when you go to the barrios, when you go to the poor neighborhoods in Venezuela, people speak about their lives having changed fundamentally and how excited they are about moving forward, and about how excited they are about all the popular initiatives of coming up with communal plans in their neighborhood for producing their own cheese or their own uniforms or something. So there's a lot of excitement within the movement, and I've seen that excitement in the context of my work on water and sanitation in Caracas. And so lastly, and I'll end with this, one of the strengths of what's happening in Venezuela, I think, is that, you know what? It really doesn't matter what we think. For example, my mother said the other day, so the major newspaper in Canada is called the Globe and Mail. It's a bullshit liberal rag. It supports the Liberal Party. And they publish bullshit after bullshit after bullshit article about Venezuela. They're always factually inaccurate and whatever. And my mom's like, you've got to write something, Susan, to correct this. And I thought, you know what? It's still really cold in Ottawa. So I'm like, I'm going to go skiing on the weekend instead of worrying about like writing an op-ed. Because it doesn't matter what we think. At some level, what matters is what the Venezuelans think. And my politics is one of international solidarity, and my politics is one of accompaniment and support, in a very similar way that left movements have supported the revolutions in Nicaragua, have supported other experiments. And so there was a wonderful article on, and I'll just read you the title. It was on a website called Truth Out, and I would recommend anybody to read it. And the title is, Venezuela's Deep Political Education Means Venezuelans Will Withstand Right-Wing Protests. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of community radio stations in Venezuela. The state took the CanTV and made it a public company in order to have an alternative form of communication. They're also sponsoring Telesur. They have their own media. And they did that after the coup in 2002 because they knew that we need to be able to communicate to the masses what's really going on, because in the 2002 coup, the right-wing media that is privately owned, one of them, Global Vision, that had its license revoked, was actually showing Tom and Jerry cartoons on continuous loop instead of showing people what was happening in the streets of Caracas. And so the reason that we're here today is because the international media is really excited about these protests because they think it's going to get rid of Maduro. It's not because it actually really matters. So I'm still convinced. I mean, I haven't been there. I haven't like talked to people. I haven't been there for a year and a half now. But I have seen the extent of what's happened in the barrios, in the poor communities in Caracas, all over the country. And I would say, and I don't want to say this as a social scientist, but it's probably the most radical experiment of democracy that we have seen historically, at least in the 21st century, without a doubt. Because there are so many spaces like the spaces that you're sitting in now, and these are spaces that are controlled by people from the neighborhoods themselves that are also given resources by the government to plan their own infrastructure, to plan their own recreational programs, to decide where to put the wheelchair ramp. This is what is happening in Venezuela, and this is why I do not think that these protests that are happening in the rich neighborhoods of Caracas are going to topple the Maduro government. So that's my rant. I talk too much. Sorry. Questions. Hello.